Welcome to the world of Paranormal M, where dark mysteries take center stage. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for your weekly dose of chills. The unknown is waiting for you. Haunting of the Fox Hollow Farms. In 2006, Rob and Vicki Graves, along with their two teenagers, decided to look for a property in suburban Indiana. They were tired of the city's fast-paced lifestyle. During their property search, they stumbled upon a property called Fox Hollow Farms, which has a huge estate, but had an abnormally low asking price. Interested in the property, the couple ended up calling the real estate agent and went on a house tour. The family was astonished by the sheer size of this house and the beauty that it emitted. While walking around the house, something struck Rob's mind. He remotely remembered hearing that this house belonged to a serial killer named Herb Baumeister. He then stopped the real estate agent and asked him if this house was actually owned by a serial killer. The agent did not refuse even a bit and agreed. He told the family that he was expecting them to ask about the killer and proceeded to share with them the history of that house. This house was originally owned by Herb Baumeister, the most notorious serial killer Indiana had ever seen. Baumeister was a completely normal child until the onset of puberty. Right after puberty hit, he started displaying antisocial behavior and started showing an obsession with the dead. He was also diagnosed with schizophrenia, which was left untreated. Later, he appeared as a successful professional, a perfect dad, a loving husband, and a perfect neighbor to others. But what he did in private was commit cold-blooded murders. He went around killing people, gay men, and buried them in his property, which is nothing but the Fox Hollow Farms. Once he knew he was getting closed down by the police, he fled to Ontario and killed himself. In his death note, he mentioned that he was killing himself because of his failing business and marriage. Police would end up finding multiple bodies on the property. The property was then purchased by a private investor who removed all of Baumeister's belongings from it. The house was later put on the market, but it failed to attract any buyers. People would come, they'd look at the house, and then end up not buying it because of its dark history. The agent told them that the house's dark history was the reason for its cheap price. Unlike the others who rejected the house previously, the Graves ended up buying it. 2 weeks later, the family moved into the house and instantly fell in love with it. The teenage sons especially loved spending time in the swimming pool at the house. They would playfully run around and bring dirt and gravel into the pool while getting back into it. Okay. So one day, Vicki was vacuuming around the pool, cleaning up the mess the boys had made. The vacuum cleaner stopped working all of a sudden. When she turned around, she saw the power cord plugged out of the socket. She thought to herself that she might have jutted out the cord accidentally, plugged it in again, and resumed the vacuuming. Just within a few moments, the power cord was plugged out again, but this time it was almost a foot away from the socket. She wondered how she could have jutted it out so far accidentally, plugged it in again, and continued vacuuming. This time, she kept looking over her shoulder to see why it was getting plugged out. She saw it getting thrown out of the socket right in front of her eyes. She was startled by it and went back into the house, dropping the vacuum on that spot. Rob worked at a car dealership. One of his employees, named Joe, was constantly turning up late for work. As he couldn't tolerate this behavior anymore, he confronted Joe and asked him the reason for always turning up late. Joe told him that he lived over an hour away, and that was the reason he couldn't be on time for work. After thinking it over for a brief period, Rob offered Joe to rent an apartment attached to his residence. Joe readily accepted, moved into the apartment a couple of days later with his dog Fred. Tired from the transportation of his goods, Joe went to bed early that night, That night he had a dream where he was being chased by someone unknown, and this made him sleepwalk. He started running away from the apartment in a half-lucid state, tumbled onto the ground, knocking over a glass. That cut his hand really badly. A couple of days later, when Vicky returned home, she found Rob painting a portion of the house. She walked toward him, and a couple started speaking about how beautiful the house would look after he finishes painting it. As they were speaking, Vicky noticed a man clothed in a red t-shirt come out of the nearby woods into the property. He stood there eerily staring at them and the house. Before she could tell Rob about it, the man went back into the woods and disappeared. Still, Vicky ended up telling Rob about the man, but Rob told her that it was quite common for a house with such a dark history to have stalkers. Vicky accepted this as their new reality and tried not to give much attention to what she had seen. Later that night, as Joe was clearing up his dishes, he heard somebody knock on the door. As Joe was doing his dishes, his hands were full of soap foam, and he was washing it off before going to check who was knocking on his door. While he was washing his hands, the knocking got louder and more aggressive. He yelled, "I'm coming," but the knocks didn't stop. Assuming it was Rob or Vicky calling him for an emergency, he rushed to the door as soon as he could and opened it. When he opened it, all he could see was emptiness. Joe initially thought that it was the work of an intruder. He looked at every place he suspected, but he found none. As he walked back toward his apartment confused, he saw someone sitting in his bedroom, and his dog stood near his bedroom just barking at it. As Joe rushed into the room, the person disappeared. He turned all the lights to make sure it was not a thief, and he found no one inside. Joe was disturbed by the knocks he heard previously. He walked out of his apartment with his dog seeking a rational explanation. As he walked through the house's driveway, he noticed a man in a red t-shirt walking into the woods. His dog started chasing this man and ran into the woods himself. Joe couldn't leave his friend in the woods, so he followed it into the woods, in fear. As he entered the woods, he saw his dog staring at him all silently. In fact, it was staring at something slightly to his side. As he slowly turned his head to see what it was, he saw the man in a red t-shirt standing right next to him. Joe ran out of the woods in fear. His dog followed him into his apartment. He locked the door, peeked out through his window to see if the man followed him. That night went by with Joe constantly looking out of the window, hoping that the man does not return. The next day, Joe rushed to Rob and Vicky and informed them about the occurrences of the previous night. When he told them about the man with the red t-shirt in the woods, Vicky immediately connected to him. She had seen the same person the previous day, after all. That night, Joe was all locked up in his apartment, hoping that the night was not as terrible as the previous night. As he was looking out of the window in fear, he heard someone knock on his door. The knocks were so aggressive that the doors literally rattled. Joe opened the door, and just like the previous night, he found no one. As he stood there looking around, he noticed that the knocker on the door stood perpendicular to the ground, as if somebody was holding it. The knocker knocked on the door one last time, with no one near it. Joe swiftly went back into his room, locked the door in fear. As he anxiously looked at the door, he saw the doorknob turn all by itself. The door burst open. He ran out of the apartment to see who was causing all of this. That's when he returned back. He saw a man, soaked completely, run out of his apartment right across him. Scared to death, Joe, along with his dog, rushed into Rob and Vicky's portion and told them what had just happened. The three of them arrived at the conclusion that the house was haunted by the victims of Baumeister, and convinced themselves that they would not harm them. But little did they know it was not just the victims haunting their property. One night, as Joe was working on his computer, he heard noises from his kitchen. When he entered the kitchen, he saw all knives neatly lined up. Joe thought that this was the work of a ghost of a victim. he felt obliged to help it. So he turned off the AC, took out his iPhone, and started recording. He asked multiple times who was in the kitchen, but got no answers. He laughed at how silly he was, but still transferred the recording to his PC and listened to it. In the recording, he heard a man answer. The married one. The creepy part is that the only one who was married in Baumeister's case was Baumeister himself. Evil never dies, after all. Haunting of the Capital City Theater. Dave in Capital City Theater. In 2006, Dave Murphy became a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first role was Protective Service Officer, which put him in charge of the physical security of the county facilities. His first facility was nothing but the Capital City Theater. This theater was a landmark in the city as it had been since, maybe the early 1900s. Dave met his partner Morgan Matthews when he first reported at the theater. He appeared to be an all-work, no-fun guy. The first thing Morgan did after their meeting was take him to the control room on the first floor of the theater. This room had monitors that showed the feed of cameras located all around the house. The cameras, however, were not in the best shape. They could only tell what was in the frame only if there was ample lighting. Since the lights were almost always turned off during the night, the cameras were literally useless then. Later, Morgan took Dave to the basement of the theater. Dave was astounded by the sheer size of the basement and was creeped out by its eeriness. Standing there was so disturbing that Dave literally ran out of it when they were done with this area. Dave was given a tour of the second and third floors of the theater as well. Once they were done with the tour, Morgan told Dave about the inspection rounds they had to do twice a day. During these rounds, they had to do a check on all the rooms of the theater, once before dawn and once after dusk. This check was to make sure the doors were locked and the lights were turned off. Once the rounds were complete, they headed back to the control room where they spent the rest of their time. That night, Dave was hopeful that he would get to know more about his partner, but Morgan didn't seem interested in speaking to him. Cut short every conversation he started. The first obscure event. Morgan accompanied Dave for the first few inspection rounds, and on the night of the third day, Dave set out to do rounds all on his own. After checking the remaining rooms of the theater, Dave finally proceeded to check the rehearsal room. This room was located on the third floor of the theater and had no door. He peeked into this room to make sure there was no one inside, and it was then he heard a door across the hallway shut close. Dave initially thought that it was the work of an intruder, walked toward this door taking his pistol in his hand. He figured out that it was the bathroom door that shut closed, and he informed Morgan to check if someone was there on the floor on the radio. When Morgan checked the camera feed, he saw no one, but because of the seriousness in Dave's voice, he headed to the third floor to check it himself. As Dave stood near this door investigating, he noticed that the door had a hydraulic hinge. This meant there was no way somebody could have shut it closed, or shut it open. As Dave was about to enter the bathroom in search of the intruder, he was joined by Morgan. The police duo searched every nook and corner of the room but found no one inside. When Dave and Morgan were sure that the intruder was not inside the bathroom, they came to the conclusion that he was running out of the bathroom and slammed the door on his way out. They started investigating the other section of the theater, with their guns still drawn. As they slowly walked down the stairs, Dave noticed lights turn on in a room on the second floor, and all other rooms on the floor had their doors wide open. Dave was confused by this sight, as he himself had closed those doors and turned off those lights. The duo's suspicion of intruders grew stronger. However, despite checking the entire theater 3 times, they could find no trace of an intruder. Morgan petrified. A couple of days later, Morgan was all alone on a shift. While he was in the control room, he heard whispers coming from the hallway behind him. Because of the experience he had 2 days back, he immediately took out his pistol. He slowly walked down the hallway in the direction of the whispers. With every step he took toward the whispers, they moved farther away from him. Following the whispers, he eventually reached the stairs leading to the basement. As he neared the basement, the whispers stopped, but he heard somebody cough in the basement. Morgan was convinced that it was an intruder and slowly walked into the basement with his gun held high. He checked every room in the basement, but just like the previous time, there wasn't a single trace of an outsider. As he was walking back to the staircase, he saw smoke coming out of the door of a room beside him. He immediately opened the door, turned on the lights, but he saw nothing abnormal aside. As he searched the room for fire, the smell of smoke slowly dissipated from the air. He checked all the rooms in the basement for fire multiple times, but just as always, there were no traces. Tales of an Accountant. A few days later, Dave went quite early for a shift. When he entered the theater, he overheard one of the theater employees speaking about the ghosts in the theater. Dave was intrigued by his conversation and told him about the experience he had in the theater. This man, who was an accountant, took Dave to his cabin on the 3rd floor and narrated the experience on his night shift. That day, the accountant was all alone in the theater since it was late in the evening. He was doing his work in his cabin on the 3rd floor when he heard the elevator engine turn on. As he looked out of his cabin through a window to see what was happening, he saw the elevator going to the basement of the theater and coming back up. As he kept staring at the elevator door, the door opened. He was awestruck by what he saw. The elevator was completely empty. He thought it was routine maintenance. He continued his work. He was disturbed again by the alarms of the elevator, and as he looked out of his cabin again, he saw the elevator door falling to close fully, as if somebody was maybe obstructing it. He walked into the elevator of curiosity, and the moment he was in, the doors closed. The elevator started moving toward the basement. When it reached the basement, he slowly walked out of the elevator and shouted, "Is anyone there?" at the empty basement. The eerie silence in the basement made him rush back to his cabin. While he was sitting in his cabin thinking about the weirdness he experienced, he heard banging noises from the hallway. As he slowly walked out of his cabin and peeked into the hallway, something that would make him run out of the theater in fear. Tales of the Accountant continued. As he slowly walked out of his cabin and peeked into the hallway, something that would make him run out of the theater in fear probably saw. He saw all of the drawers in a file cabinet situated at the end of the hallway drawn out, and as he stood gazing at the strangeness, all drawers shut closed by themselves right in front of his eyes. This scared him so much that he ran out of the theater, leaving all of his belongings behind. Dave's friend visits the theater. As the paranormal events continued, Dave decided to offer a tour of the theater to his friend in order to get extra validation. After Morgan approved this idea, Dave called his friend Greg, offered him a tour of the theater, which he readily accepted. The next day, Greg was greeted by Dave and Morgan at the theater. The tour started at the main auditorium, and once they were done, they moved into the basement. As they walked through the hallway of the basement, Dave noticed that a door on their left was open. Dave and Morgan immediately pulled out their pistols. They aimed at the open door and slowly walked toward it with Greg just behind them. When they were about to enter the room, the door shut right in their face. Before they could react, the door handle started to rattle aggressively. Once the rattling stopped, Morgan and Dave broke into the room. Greg, being too scared of staying all alone in the hallway, followed them into the room. While they were looking around the room, Greg gasped and pointed at a corner of the room. He said the other two that someone was sitting in that corner. But when Dave and Morgan swiftly turned toward the corner, they saw no one. At this point, all three were scared to death, ran out of the basement as fast as they could. Once they were out of the basement, Greg decided his time at the theater was up, and he left it. Morgan quits. After multiple requests, the cameras in the theater were replaced with better cameras with infrared lights. This meant that the cameras offered upgraded night vision. The very first shift after the camera installations were assigned to Morgan. As he was in the control room getting used to the new system, he noticed a man sitting in the main auditorium of the theater on the camera feed. This man slowly turned his head toward his camera. He kind of stared up at it with his glaring eyes. Morgan felt as if this man was directly staring at him. As Morgan watched this man through the feed, he raised into the ceiling and disappeared in thin air. It was the last straw for Morgan. He raised a request for transfer on the very next day. Dave quits. A few days after Morgan was transferred, Dave had to spend a night alone at the theater. After performing the routine rounds, Dave returned to the control room and started monitoring the camera feed. All of a sudden, he heard a piano playing. He immediately headed toward the basement since he knew that was the only place the piano was in the theater. As he neared the basement stairs, he pulled out his gun and walked toward the piano in stealth. As he neared the piano, he figured out that the piano was playing on its own. As he took another step toward it, the piano guard shut closed. He instinctively ran out of the basement and, similar to Morgan, raised a request to transfer the very next day. A new officer greeted by the paranormal. After Dave and Morgan forced their transfer, the police department could not find a permanent security officer for the theater. After multiple failed attempts, they found a veteran officer named Josh Thomas for the job. However, on his very first day of duty, he heard voices in the basement. He went down to check the cause, but despite turning on all the lights and doing a thorough check, he found no one. As he made his way to the third floor, the elevator turned on by itself. Went down to the basement, returned back to the third floor. As Josh stood staring at the elevator door, it opened with no one inside. This event made Josh strongly believe that someone else was in the theater with him. Since he was the only one on shift that day, he called for backup on the radio. Coincidentally, Dave was in rounds near the theater, and upon hearing his call for backup, he immediately went to the theater to help him. When Dave entered the theater, he was greeted by Josh's petrified face. Dave asked him not to worry, and the duo proceeded to clear the theater. They checked all the rooms except the main auditorium. But just as Dave anticipated, there was no one. Before Dave left, they decided to check the main auditorium once. They went into the main auditorium and stood on the stage chatting with each other. They were positioned in such a way that Dave had his back facing the seats and Josh was facing him. Josh suddenly started stuttering and stopped mid-sentence. He was looking over Dave's shoulder with his frightened eyes. When Dave asked him what was bothering him, Josh said something is standing behind him. As Dave slowly turned his head, he saw a man standing at a corner facing the wall. He was looking down and his head was covered by a hood. By the time Dave completely turned, this man turned around quickly, looked directly at them. He had extremely sunken eyes, a terribly burnt-looking face. He teleported himself to the backside door and disappeared right in front of their eyes. A terrible accident. Desperate to find an answer to the events in the theater, Dave dug deep into its history After performing a complete study of the building's history, he got to know about a major fire accident in the theater in the 40s. During this accident, a man was stuck in the basement and was burnt to death by the fire. Dave was convinced that the phantom of this man was the reason behind all the paranormal events in the theater. Eerie Encounters. Magdalena Salas, the High Priestess of Blood. Sebastian witnesses anomaly. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a mountain range that starts from the southern border of Texas and continues 700 miles through the northwest section of Mexico. Almost halfway across this mountain range, on its eastern face, lie a series of caves. Many small isolated villages that are populated mainly by illiterate poor farmers are situated around these caves. On one night in May 1963, a 14-year-old boy from one of these small villages named Sebastian Guerrero. That's a hard thing. You guys know I can't speak Spanish. Went out to venture into these caves. He did it quite often, as there is a local belief that these caves had treasure in them. As always, he got out of his house, walked up the mountain, started walking toward the first cave opening he saw. As he was walking, he saw a light come out of the cave opening far away on his right. From what he knew, the caves never had people visit them before, especially at night, had seen this light intriguing the young boy. He started walking toward this lit-up cave, and with every step he took toward it, he was going farther away from his village. As he got closer and closer to the cave, he started hearing a sound that appeared to be the laughs or screams of a person. His curiosity increased. He walked even faster toward the cave. At about 200 feet away from the opening, he started hearing people sighing or singing and chanting in unity. One person screaming out of extreme pain. Sebastian slowly snuck into the cave entrance, hid behind a big opening and peeked into it. What he saw inside terrorized him. Started running away from the cave as fast as he could. While running, he had a strong sensation that he was being followed. The young boy did not run toward his village, but to a nearby police station that was almost 10 miles away. Sebastian didn't even stop running after he broke into the front door of the police station. The police, who were completely off guard by him, calmed down the hysterical boy. After he finally composed himself, he opened up to the police about what he had been seeing. Sebastian and Louis go missing. Sebastian told the police that he saw a vampire inside the cave, surrounded by a group of people. The police, who were serious until then at least, let out a sigh of relief, told the young boy that he might have had a nightmare, and drove him back to the village. When Sebastian woke up the next day, he wasn't able to get what he had seen the previous night. Couldn't get it out of his head. He was extremely disturbed. So he went back to the police station, asked him to investigate the cave. The police, however, never took him seriously. They shooed him away. He repeatedly insisted that something evil and dangerous was there inside the cave, and if they did not intervene, it would take the lives of people. After pleading repeatedly, one officer named Luis Martinez asked Sebastian to take him to the cave so he could investigate. Sebastian, who was grateful to the officer, got into the car with him and took him to the cave. Later in the day, the other officers started to grow worried as Louis and the kid had not returned after heading to the cave. Also, Louis was not reachable on his radio. The police waited for them to... Computer glitch. The police waited for him to return. That was until that evening, after which they went to Sebastian's village, hoping that the boy would have returned. But even Sebastian's whereabouts were not known. It was at this point that the police understood that it was an emergency. As they were understaffed, they sought the help of the Mexican military, headed toward the cave in search of Louis and Sebastian. What they saw would shock the entire world. In order to know what they saw inside, let us travel back to December of 1962. The ploy of the Hernandez brothers. Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, two scammers who were also brothers, they engineered a plan to grow wealth quickly. To execute it, they went to a small isolated village called Yerba Buena, which had only 20 families, and whose primary occupants were literate and poor. This village was present right below the cave which Sebastian and Louis went to investigate. Right before the new year, this scammer duo got into Yerba Buena. They put on a dramatic show, telling how they were the prophets of an exiled Incan god. They told them that if they were obedient and did the thing they commanded, this god would bring them wealth. They were extremely good salesmen, and as a result they convinced the gullible villagers into believing their disguise and obeying them. The villagers believed their words so much that they practically became slaves to the brothers. They gave them anything they wanted and did everything they asked them to do. However, after a couple of months, some of the villagers started to get frustrated with the brothers as they were losing their wealth instead of gaining some. Also, they were being treated extremely bad by the Hernandez brothers, which made them question if they were really prophets. As this opinion was slowly beginning to become the opinion of the whole village, the brothers who had already looted the village dry decided to try and rescue their mission. Entry of the pseudo-goddess. To accomplish this, they went to close by a city and went in search of prostitutes to aid them with their ploy. Their search ended when they met Magdalena Salas, a prostitute in the city. They told them about their ploy and asked her to pretend as an actual income goddess, interesting term, to instigate belief in the villagers once again. She liked this idea and agreed to it in exchange for some money. So she, along with her brother who acted as her pimp, was taken to the village secretively by the Hernandez brothers. The scammer duo dressed her in an Incan goddess costume and hid her in one of the caves in the mountain. Later, they went to the village, gathered up the villagers, told them that they had a special ceremony in the cave, and took them into the cave. After all of them were inside, they created a smokescreen using basic magic tricks and made the Magdalena emerge out of it as a goddess. Standing amidst the smoke, she told them that she would kill them if they would dare to disobey her. The villagers were intimidated by what she had said and ended up completely believing her. The villagers started believing the Hernandez brothers again. Things seemed to work. Everything went as planned except for the pseudo-goddess change in attitude. After being a prostitute for a major portion of her life, the way these villagers saw her gave her a sense of control and respect for the very first time. She started herself as a goddess of the village, and this goddess was not really a merciful one. She completely took control over the village by giving death threats, soon raised to the pinnacle of the authority structure, surpassing the Hernandez brothers. Although the brothers didn't like this, they didn't intervene as they were getting to exploit the villagers the way they wanted. Magdalena's blood rituals. As time went by, the pseudo-goddess started to abuse the villagers physically, mentally, and sexually. She started displaying strong sadomasochistic and pedophilic tendencies and used the village to fulfill her extreme fetishes. Ugh. She also convinced herself that in order to stay a goddess, she had to drink blood. Of course. Hence, she demanded the villagers to provide her with blood, which they heeded. They slaughtered their farm animals and pets, drained out their blood, and gave it to the pseudo-goddess. As the abuses and blood rituals continued, two villagers in some time in April felt that they had endured enough. They decided to flee the village. The Hernandez brothers, who somehow got to know about this, told Magdalena about it. After getting to know about this, she immediately told the villagers to get into the cave for a special ceremony. Once everyone was in, she pointed at the two who were planning an escape, ordered the remaining to kill them. The other villagers obliged and beat the two of them to death. Once they were dead, Magdalena dragged their corpse to a pike she had set up in the cave and tied them up. She then took a chalice, walked toward the corpses, and pressed it against the bodies to fill it with their blood. Once it was filled, she proceeded to drink it. It was at this point that the pseudo-goddess felt that she should drink human blood instead of animal blood. In the oncoming weeks, Magdalena would call the villagers often for these blood rituals, asking the villagers to perhaps... Oops, I dropped something. Asking the villagers... to kill the one that she pointed at and drink their blood. With time, she felt that killing the sacrifices spoils their blood. So she started to tie them up, cut out their hearts while they were still alive, and drink their blood. Sebastian and Luis are discovered. This exact scene is what poor Sebastian saw that night in the cave. The next day, when he and the officer went to the cave to investigate, they would have their hearts carved out by the pseudo-goddess who would drink their blood as well. When the police and armed force arrived at the cave, they were attacked by the villagers, which led to a shootout. The shootout killed most of the villagers and the Hernandez brothers. Once the shootout stopped, they headed into the cave in search of the boy and the officer. However, they were able to only find their heartless bodies surrounded by pieces of human flesh. After searching the village, they found Magdalena and her brother hiding in a hut. They were later convicted, sentenced to 50 years in jail. Not really paranormal at all. Weird, though. Eerie Encounters: The Daunting Case of Michael Taylor. An early 1974 34-year-old man named Michael Taylor was leading a happy life with his wife Christine and his 5 children in Ossett, West Yorkshire. He was a perfect father and a loving husband with a commendable sense of humor. His neighbors report that they would often hear Michael laughing or cracking jokes while they crossed his house. However, this beautiful family would lose their happiness in the April of the same year. Michael and the Christian Fellowship. One day in the April of 1974, Michael was doing some house repairs while standing on a ladder. He accidentally slipped off the ladder and hurt his back badly. Although this injury wasn't major, it caused chronic pain which changed Michael's personality. The happy, humorous man became extremely depressed and irritable. His behavior was so bad that his family could barely stay around him. While the Taylors were not religious, most families around them in their locality were. So some of the neighbors, who were also Michael's family, persuaded him to seek God for healing his ailment. They also specifically suggested a Christian group called the Christian Fellowship. It was a religious group that offered support even during the non-Sundays. The group's leader was a 21-year-old extremely friendly woman named Marie Robinson, and his friends told him that she could potentially be the difference maker in his life. On the 12th of September of the same year, Michael joined the group, and he was astonished by the way Marie carried himself, and the way people treated her. Her. Praying with this group helped reduce his chronic pain and filled him with happiness again. He started spending more time with this group, which also meant that he was spending more time with Marie. The duo had a strong bond growing between them. They started spending more time with each other, and all Michael told to his family was about Marie. Road to exorcism. Their closeness caused rumors about an affair that they had. These rumors slowly spread from the religious group to almost all ears in town. Michael's wife eventually heard these rumors, started suspecting his husband of infidelity. What? A little bit confused. One day, while Michael was praying with the group, his wife burst into the hall where they were praying and shouted at him, asking him to confess his affair. While she was shouting, Michael had his back toward her. He slowly tilted his head toward Marie and started staring at her. Just a few moments after establishing eye contact with him, Marie shouted in fear. She said that he looked nothing like a human. While the whole bunch of people were looking at Marie, Michael started blabbering something in a language none of them knew. He suddenly started running toward Marie like he wanted to kill her. The other members of the group piled up on him to stop him, but he never stayed still. After the people around him prayed for almost an hour, Michael finally fell unconscious and woke up as his normal self. After this event, Marie told Michael and his family that he was possessed and an exorcism should be performed on him as soon as possible. So they reached out to an Anglican church, which in turn would send two of their best named, Raymond and Peter, for his exorcism. Exorcism and murder. This duo performed the exorcism ritual on Michael for an entire day, by the end of which he was completely exhausted. At the end of the ritual, they told him that he was possessed by 40 demons, and 37 of them were driven out. Since Michael was completely exhausted, they told him that they would complete his exorcism the next day. So Michael ended up returning home with his wife that day. That must be weird. A few hours later, one of Michael's neighbors heard strange noises outside her house. When she slightly pulled a curtain aside and peeked through a window, she saw a completely naked Michael Taylor covered completely in blood. He was walking around yelling praises of Satan. This woman was petrified at the sight. His behavior, ended up calling the police. When the police arrived, they saw Michael laying near that woman's doorstep in a fetal position. He was giggling like a baby as the officials questioned him. He finally snapped out of his state and looked up at the police officials, all confused. The police then got to know about his identity. After calling for backup, the officials entered Michael's house. The first officer who entered the house ran out of it because of the frightening thing he saw inside. What he saw would become the most disturbing crime scenes in English history. A few hours after he returned from the exorcism, Michael slipped back into his trance. He became extremely violent and started attacking his wife. He pinned her to the ground, and with his bare hands gouged out her eyes and pulled out her tongue. The assault didn't stop there. He tore off her face and with his hands and threw it across the room. As the woman was taking her final painful breaths, he smeared the blood oozing out of her once normal face on his naked body and enjoyed watching her die. Ugh. Aftermath. Michael was convicted, but was not declared guilty on the grounds of insanity. He spent 4 years in psychiatric care, after which he was sent back to general population. Okay. So, was Michael a man possessed by demons or a demon in man's form? I'll leave it to your judgment. Eerie Encounters, Alexanders, a Cult and a Family. The Alexanders entered the Lorber Society. In the early 1950s, a young stonemason named Harold Alexander living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George. George was a leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society, which was rooted in the Christian faith. Their views, however, were far more extreme than an average Christian. While most Christians believe in self-denial to gain favor with God, George and the other members of the Labor Society, or LORBR, took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively that nobody in the society could live a normal life. They prayed to God 24/7. To add on, members of the LORBR Society also believed that anybody who was not part of them was evil. So, when Harold met George, he was blown away by him as George was extremely charismatic. George had a similar admiration for Harold, which instantly made them friends. This friendship made Harold and his wife, Dragma, join the LORBR Society. They wholeheartedly got into this extreme way of life and obediently listened to everything George told them. Harold rises in the ranks of the society. A few days after Harold and his wife joined the society, George was struck by illness. He was nearing his demise rapidly. Harold visited George when George was on his deathbed. When he returned after the meeting, he told his wife that George told him he was going to be the next leader of the LORBR Society when George dies. His wife, along with the rest of the society members, believed this, and when George eventually died, they accepted him as their leader. They revered him, just like they did with George, and devotionally accepted his words. Frank, a prophet of God. When Harold led the society, he continuously told them the next prophet of God would be returning to Earth, and they apparently should be ready for it. He claimed that he would know immediately when the prophet arrives and orders them to do whatever this prophet wanted without question, as it was God's will. In 1953, Harold and his wife Dragma birthed their second child, which was also their first boy. They named him Frank. As soon as Frank was born, Harold decisively said that his son was the prophet that they'd all been waiting for, and all the members accepted it without a second opinion. As Frank grew up, he was continually worshipped 24/7 by the members of the LORBR Society, which included his own family. This had a major impact on his behavior. By the time Frank was at the age of a grade school child, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to boss around his family, especially his three sisters and his mother. But he was never confronted, as he was considered as a prophet of God. The Alexanders fled to Spain. When Frank turned 16, he started feeling the need for sex. But since society thought pretty much everybody out of that society was evil, he got a weird idea. Since he didn't want to pollute himself with the evil outside, he went to his father, told him that he wanted to ease his sexual urges by copulating with the family's woman. Okay. His father, instead of confronting him, encouraged this idea. To add to the grotesqueness, the family woman readily accepted their new role as they firmly believed pleasing him was pleasing God. As this weirdness went on, one of Frank's sisters told one of her friends in school about her jealousness when Frank engaged with the other woman in the house. This event started rumors about the family's incestual behavior, which eventually ended with the police catching their trials. Also, the LORBR Society started distancing itself from the family as they dejected the idea of incest. This led to Harold and his fleeing to Santa Cruz, a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. Despite their change in locality, their belief system didn't change. They continued worshipping Frank in their small apartment amidst the busy city. A creeped-out doctor. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter heard a knock on the door of his villa. When he opened it, he saw two men covered head to toe in something that resembled mud. When he asked what they wanted, they told him they wanted to meet Sabine, his 15-year-old housemaid, as they were her father and brother. Yes, the two men were Harold and Frank. Heeding their request, Walter called for Sabine, and once she arrived at the door, he started walking away to give the personal space. He suddenly stopped, overhearing the terrible things they were speaking about. He started sweating profusely after hearing their conversation and rushed into a room to call the police. When the police arrived, they found Harold and his children calm and composed. This was contradicting, as from what the police heard from Walter, the family can't be so calm after performing such a hideous act. Harold continued to tell the police about the terrible actions he committed with such calmness that the police were dumbfounded. The police right away headed to Harold's apartment. When they opened the apartment door, they immediately understood that Harold was not bluffing. So, what actually happened? It was the killing hour. The killing hour. According to Frank and Harold, women were innately evil, and they could only go to heaven if they were murdered and had their evil organs mutilated. This concept was strongly believed by them, and the women of the family completely accepted it, as according to them, Frank was a prophet of God and everything. He commanded was God's own command. On December 21st, 1970, Harold and his wife were taking a nap in their bedroom. Frank went into their bedroom, sat in the corner of their bed, and kept staring at his mom. His mom incidentally opened her eyes and looked at Frank in a way that he describes as offensive. Offended by her so-called offensive sight, Frank declared the killing hour. He grabbed a wooden coat hanger near him and started beating his own mom on her head. Instead of fighting against the assault, she lied on her back, kept her hands on her sides, and got into a position that made it easier for him to assault her, as it was the killing hour. His father, instead of stopping him, jumped out of the bed, ran into the hall, and started playing his organ in ecstasy. Jesus. After hitting his mom's head until she fell unconscious, he proceeded to assault his two other sisters until they fell unconscious. Sabina escaped her death as she stayed in the doctor's house that week. While the three women were lying unconscious, Frank went to the kitchen and brought a knife with him. With that knife, he proceeded to cut off the breasts and genitals, according to him, the evil organs. He did this of the still-alive women, nailed them to the walls. He further proceeded to carve out his mother's heart, wrapped it with a cord, and had hung it on the wall. And by the way, guys, I did not pick these stories. Well, I don't have all that much saying, all that much. By then, the women were all dead, and the father-son duo left their apartment. They would then spend that night in another property of theirs before meeting Sabine. Harold and Frank were put into asylums from which they escaped after 20 years. Their whereabouts after their escape still stay obscure. Ghost stalking me. This is a current issue I'm having. That's a bit of a backstory. My life isn't short of paranormal experiences. And even currently, I'm sharing my house with spirits that have been here much longer than I have. I also live near a very big graveyard. Around the start of the year, I started feeling like I was being followed down the stairs. Never follows me fully downstairs, sometimes leaning over, almost touching me, sometimes crawling. It will not go near the last 5 steps. Instead, it just followed me as I go up or down them, and anywhere around the top part of that house. Sometimes I brush my teeth, and it's leaning over, watching me in the mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it, but last weekend my husband went to see his family for a few days, leaving me alone in the house with our 2 dogs. The first night was fine. I had no issues. But the next day I started feeling it again, just following me about. I tried to ignore it as much as possible. Normally it would go away after a while, but not that day. I felt it stronger as time went by, most likely as it realized my husband wasn't home yet. By nighttime, I was getting flash images in my mind of long, unkempt black hair. Its back hunched over, its pale face was not new to me. I'd caught sight of its face in the mirror in the past. I go to best as fast as possible, perhaps bed. Once again, it would normally not come into the bedroom, but that night was not a normal night. I was alone. At this point, I'm already in bed. I feel it step in and slowly make its way over to where I'm laying. Creeps in close to me, leans down, turns its face to match up with mine. It then just stares. That's all it ever does, stare. I've had others do this before, but they always kept their distance, but this one, it likes to be almost pressing up against me. I feel its static. In the end, I had to turn around and face the other way to get any sleep. The next night was exactly the same. On the day of my husband's return, everything was fine. When it got to night, it started up again. By the time I had to get ready for bed, I was being followed again. My husband comes upstairs, also getting ready for bed. At this point, I'm talking freely about how the creep is hiding in the airing cupboard, thinking that this will stop it from being seen by my husband. What is an airing cupboard? So I make my way to bed, and it's keeping its distance. It doesn't follow me into the room, but instead goes into the spare room and just waits. The only thing it did that night was get as close to the wall as it could. Fast forward a few days to current times. It's the 1st of May, and the creep is back. It just followed me on my trip to the bathroom and decided to touch my hair. I'm back downstairs now, and I can feel it just sitting and waiting on the stairs. Tried telling it that it's taking the piss. I've even told it to stop, but it just keeps at it. It doesn't reacted to the fact that I had pointed out that I know it's there. I'm not sure what you do, and it doesn't seem to want anything other than to stalk me. Sorry for the spelling, it's hard to do anything when I can feel it staring. I'm getting stalked in my own home by a spirit. The creep will not leave me alone. Woman in the corn. After a long day, I went to bed and shut my eyes, only to be instantly met with an image of an old farm field. The scarecrow was nothing more than broken wood and a few tattered bits of clothes. The field was overgrown with weeds and mounds of dirt covered in untamed grass. The view panned down and sank under the earth. There in the dirt, I was met with a woman's face, the plant roots just above her head. Her face was pointed toward me, roots by her right side. I opened my eyes to try and shake the images. I shut them again, and there she still was, dead. Her pale skin rotting in the dirt, alone and forgotten. It felt so real. Opened my eyes again, moved about in the hope that when I would shut them again, that it would just all be gone. Finally, I shut my eyes again. This time the field was back, but full of corn. The scarecrow, even though it was still worn, had a face and stuffing in its old body, hat looking like it was going to fall off. I opened my eyes again, spoke with my partner until the images were gone. All happened in a few minutes. I felt so bad that she was just left there. The field's not that big. It once had a small wooden fence. It's by a wooded-looking area. I'm not sure if it was woods or just a line of trees. The field felt slightly isolated, as if it would take a bit to get it from a road. All I can think of is that I hope someone one day will find her, wake her from her lonesome sleep in the field. Haunting Smiler. This is the second scariest thing I've had to deal with, at least of the paranormal nature. I've lived in this house for almost 2 years now, and this is the only place where it's happened. The first encounter happened in the first year, and the last 3 have been in the past 4 months or so. Another thing to note is that I can wake myself up from bad dreams. My brain kicks in and tells me, it's okay, it's just a dream, just wake up. It takes on the form of whatever it wants, but its face is always the same. I know how this is going to sound. I tried to find anything on such a thing, and I've only found creepypastas. I'm going to try my best to describe it. The first thing to spring to your mind will be Jeff or Momo, but these do not look anything like it. This thing's features are very human-like, as if its face is just a tiny bit past the realm of what a human could manage. Its eyes are always effortlessly wide open, so wide I make out the roundness of its eyeballs. So focused and so intense, like the shocked eyes of someone is realizing that they're going to die and there's nothing they can do. Its mouth is a closed smile. This, too, is effortlessly. The mouth never moves and is always shut. I swear that it's perhaps its preferred expression. Best example I can think of that comes close to it is Jack Nicholson's Joker smile. It's a good one. And yet with all of this, its face is somehow blank, and this thing's making like, as they put it, and this thing, never makes a single sound. Final encounter. I was dreaming of cleaning the house. Dull, I know, but I went to put some towels in the airing cupboard. Airing cupboard again. Yes, Gecko, I know. Realized something felt off. It's like something's out of place and it shouldn't even exist. I looked to where the feeling was coming from, and there standing by the boiler was my partner. At first, I was confused. To get to one, you would have taken out a bunch of shelves. There wouldn't be much room to stand normally, even with the shelves out, but they were still in. I started to feel more and more unsettled as I looked at them. I then realized that it was a facial expression. Everything but that face looked like my partner. Of course, my brain kicks in and tells me to just wake up and it'll be gone. So, that's what I do. But once awake, I can't shake off the feeling or that face. Still scared of what I'll find when I open the airing cupboard door. Second encounter. After an epic dream about a boat trip after a war, I went into a shop and was looking around. I stood there staring at sometimes hanging on the hooks when I had an off feeling again. Out of the corner of my eye, I see someone walk next to me and stare at the items too. I looked around and they turned to face me. They turned their whole body as if they were standing still on a turning table. Looking back at me was that face again, but in someone else's body. Someone I had a dream about the night before. I quickly turned away, and once again my brain kicked in with a big nope, and I woke up. Third encounter. I having sleeping issues. No big surprise, right? And on this night, I couldn't get to sleep. My surroundings started to feel weird, and I know something was about to enter the room. I turned around, pulled the cover up to about eye height. The second it came into the room, it hit me. That exact same feeling it gives off. But this time, it's not my dream. It's standing right up to the side of my bed. It didn't walk, it just appeared. For the first time, it moved. From the hips and lower back, it bent over me. This thing was bent over me at a 90-degree angle. Its face hovered inches from my own. I grabbed hold of my partner and slowly pulled myself close to them. I clenched my eyes shut, tried to think of anything else other than what was happening. Flashes of its facial features would appear to me. Then it stopped. It vanished. I realized my grip on my partner spent a good hour just staring at the ceiling. fourth encounter. And now we get to last night. I was dreaming of sitting on a bed, playing with a phone that belonged to the sister in my dream. The battery got low and I started to install the game on my phone. The sister walks in and starts shouting at me, telling game she forbids me to install it, and that I can only play it on her phone. I tell her where to shove it, and she walks out claiming to be going to turn the internet off to stop me. She walks off and I moan about her. Then the feeling again. The gecko is roaring. I turned to the doorway that the sister walked through, and there, high up, it was looking at me. The only thing that could be seen was the head up to the start of the nose, and this time it has stolen the sister's look. There on the top of the head, clear as day, was the sister's brown hair. The sister was not this tall. Its eyes looked at me. I could feel it smile, and it stared at me. Instead of trying to wake me up, my brain and body went straight into trying to physically scream. My partner woke me up after my first 2 muffled screams. This thing seems hell-bent on torturing me. I don't have any plans of moving anytime soon. I just hope somebody may know what this is. For those of you who wonder what the first scariest thing I've had to deal with is, I met the old hag. But that's for another time, since I promise you that this was a completely different thing almost every way. Lastly, for anybody who's going to suggest it's sleep paralysis, I admit I had sleep paralysis, but it feels different, and I also don't see things when I get it. The only thing that happens in my body is it starts to feel weird, and I can normally just move to avoid it. If failing to do so, then it does nothing but serve to annoy me, and it's easy to break out of. Someone used to talk to me when I was a kid and explained how some things in the world worked. I was born in 2003, so I'm 19 now. I don't remember when exactly it happened, but it certainly was between 2007 and 2009 when I was 4 or 6. There were days when I would make questions about the world around me, which is natural for that age. The thing is I recall at least 2 events in which I made a question, and I don't remember what question I made, but I'm almost certain one of them was about trees. And suddenly, everything around me stopped moving for a very short time. Like if time had stopped except for myself. While the time was paralyzed, somebody would talk to me, answering the questions. I recall on both occasions the voice who answered me was a soft male voice that anybody'd be scared by. That the voice was so friendly that hearing it made me feel in peace. After the voice answered my questions, and I didn't really knew the answers it gave me, so there's no way that I could have just imagined it. Time would return to normal, like nothing happened. Eventually, after it happened the second time, it never happened again. I eventually forgot about it, save for a single occasion that I remembered back in 2012. That was until 2019, when for some reason I remembered those events and never forgot it. Also, in 2019, around October and December, I was in my grandparents' room staring at the night sky. That's when my eyes fixated on a cloud for no reason. It was no different from any other cloud, but it made me curious, so I kept staring at it. Suddenly, a blue sphere of light passed through that cloud at an impressive speed. I didn't manage to look too much at it, but I remember that besides the blue color, it had a bright white core. I'm not sure if this is related to the voice that I used to hear when I was a kid or not. Both my grandparents also had experiences with UFOs when they were younger. My late grandpa saw one as a child, and my grandma was still a baby at the time, but her mother and grandmother saw it. They told her about it. Frank Sinatra's summer house in Palm Springs. This story happened to me on May 22nd, 2022. My wife and I were spending the night at Frank Sinatra's house in Palm Springs. This is the day after our wedding, on a Sunday. We'd been there since Friday. On Sunday night, I had stayed up late and didn't realize how late it was as I was stargazing by the pool, smoking a joint. I decided to go back to the main bedroom where my wife was asleep. I made sure to walk the property, locking any open doors and closing any open windows. As I made my way back to the bed, I walked into the bedroom and checked the time. It was 3:15. I thought, damn, it's late. Close the door, turn around, start to take a step toward bed. The door, as I take my second step, clicks and opens. Now, I know what you're thinking because I thought the same thing. I'm under the influence and there's a small chance that I didn't shut the door. Debunked. So I turn around, close the door again. But this time I push the door to make sure it's closed and I lock the door. So, as I think that's the end of that, I just jump in bed, put on cartoons, and get ready to knock out. That's when I start hearing on the glass wall or door that goes in the backyard. I really think nothing of it. I ignore it. That is until I hear a click again. Then I watch the door swing open and slam against the door, and that wakes my wife up. We both freaked out. I searched the entire house for any anomalies. I then went to use the restroom, famous Frank Sinatra broken sink room. And as I'm using the restroom, I hear the clicking of a light switch. Nothing's turning on and off. I think nothing of it, and then my wife proceeds to hear the same thing that she used to hear in the restroom. The rest of the night, we're hearing scratches, knocks on windows, and what sounded like walking on the roof. We told the property management company about it, and they had said it was the first time somebody reported something like this happening. Weird experience. Won't be staying there again by ourselves.